and welcome to our slightly late but still better than ever episode of Essay Reads for July/early August. My name is Lisa Endersby, and I'm joining you from the sunny shores of Toronto, Ontario, Canada. And Kristen and I are going to be chatting about The Heart of Higher Education today by Parker Palmer. We're just tweeting out our Google On Air Hangout link so you can follow along with us today. We're trying something a little bit different this time around for our Essay Reads extravaganza. We're still going to give you the option to tweet along or join us if you have questions or comments. But Kristen and I love Parker Palmer and love this book so much that we could probably fill the hour on our own. So we're taking the pressure off of you today, and we're going to be chatting for about 45, 50 minutes or so, just chatting about some of our favorite quotes in the book, what we thought about it, and how it might impact our professional practice. But of course, feel free to follow along, #EssayReads. We will continue to check back and forth and see your comments and take your questions as we chat about the book. So I'm going to let Kristen introduce herself and then kick us off for some of our first bits of discussion.
Okay, hi everybody, I'm Kristen. I work at University of Missouri, Kansas City and in web development, but my, of course, side passion is reading. I don't even know if I call it a side, I just call it a passion, is reading. And this book is no exception. I loved it, loved all of it. I love Parker Palmer, he's fantastic. So I'll go ahead and start us with some of the quotes. I had probably a good page and a half of quotes that I pulled from this book because there was so much good stuff. And feel free to share any of your favorite quotes on the Twitter back channel or questions that you have. Again, Essay Reads. We'll mention that probably a few thousand times while we talk today, just to make sure that you can get a hold of us. So I think one of the things to really start us off, and we'll start with the first. I know we're talking about the second half of the book today, but really what the whole book is about integrative education. And so this quote really, I think, sums up the book in a lot of ways. Is the real question is whether we want higher education to be about life. Lisa, did you have any thoughts about that?
Whew. Did I ever, Kristen? Kristen and I love to exchange quotes about the book, and this book, when Kristen sent me a list of quotes, it was basically like she rehashed the entire book. So she and I, as I said, we can talk for hours about this stuff, but also, as Kristen said, I think this quote really sums up the book in and of itself. For me personally, and I'm going to warn everybody, I'm going to get on my pedestal and my high horse a little bit, my soapbox. What I took from this, and of course there are many different ways to interpret this quote, but the first thing that came to mind for me when Parker Palmer talks about life in higher education, it's that whole idea of the real world. And notice that because this is Google Hangout on Air, you can see me, I'm using air quotes when I talk about the real world. We talk a lot in higher education in any department, sometimes some more than others. I have experience in career services, and that's one area where this word gets thrown, or term gets thrown around a lot. The whole idea that we're preparing students for the real world, which seems to imply that inside the walls of the university or the college or behind the screen of whatever online course you're taking, that it's no longer the real world. Maybe it's a fake world or a different world or some semblance of the real world. I also have a background in philosophy, so we talk about possible worlds. And I just find it very odd that there's this strange but accepted separation between life outside of higher education and life within higher education, that we're somehow preparing students to transition out of this bubble into the real world. And Parker Palmer, when he talks about integrative education, and you'll see in some of the other quotes that Kristen and I talk about or will share later, the idea of wholeness is not just a buzzword. It very much is the foundation of what higher education means. So what happens inside the classroom should really be no different than what happens to the student outside of the classroom. Yes, there are obvious differences in content and the way things are shared, but life is life and happens whether you're sitting in class or walking to it. So I love that Parker Palmer really is talking about wholeness, talking about holistic education, integrating life into higher education, so that we're not necessarily preparing students for life because they're living it. We're supporting them in the journey that they're already on. I'll step off my pedestal and take that over to you, Kristen, to see what you think.
Yeah, I mean, this one of the things I felt about this book overall was that it preaches a lot of what we talk about in student affairs, that the education that happens is more than just what is going on in the classroom. that it's what happens outside the classroom as well. And that's really what this is talking about, that we're not just educating students on topics that are what their classes are, but how to apply those topics to life. And that's really what this quote said to me, and why it really rang true for me. Should we just go down the list? We've got, like I said, we've got a long list of quotes.
We've got a novel, Kristen. We have a whole novel.
I know. I really copied like the entire book. Essentially, it was really good.
Yeah.
You know, one of the things, and I'm going to skip all the way down to the bottom, but this is ringing true again, is educate our students as whole people, and they will bring all of who they are to the demands of being human in private and public life. And that kind of, again, sums up the book. And it really talks about that idea that we're not just educating them to be students, we're educating them to be people. Mm-hmm. And we're a really important part of their developmental process.
And when I read that, I thought a lot about the idea of identity and identity development, particularly around something near and dear to my heart and Kristen's as well, digital identity development, and all of the things that go into creating a social media profile and presence, and bringing your whole self in public and in private, and how even those two terms are so different nowadays. And many of you can probably understand that being on Twitter yourselves, the whole notion of what it means to be in public, the whole notion of what it means to be private, how much we value privacy, how much we value publicity or being in public, and how much our students value that nowadays. Calls for transparency, calls for accountability, but also wanting to be seen and to be heard, perhaps more than in the past, because there are so many avenues available to us and to them. So again, the idea of being the whole student while also having to navigate and present different parts of themselves in different places. So while Parker Palmer talks about the idea of wholeness, I think while these quotes are great ideas and are philosophies we certainly subscribe to, there are probably a lot more challenges than we even comprehend or understand, and how to get students to do this effectively and how to get us to do that effectively, to role model it, when there are so many ways we can be separate and show separate parts of ourselves even though we're striving for wholeness.
There's, he actually references, Parker Palmer references another one of his books, The Undivided Life, I think is what it's called. I'll go Google it later. But anyways, and he talks is essentially about that to live outside what you believe inside is to live an undivided life. And that rang really true with me, especially, again, like Lisa mentioned, when we're talking about digital identity and how we represent ourselves, and making sure that that is congruent with who we are inside as well.
Mm-hmm. So, Kristen, I'm going to throw it to you and give you a quote to comment on.
All right.
That I really liked. So there are pieces, again, when we talk about wholeness and when we talk about holistic and integrative education, but Parker Palmer very astutely knows that being holistic and being in integrative education is not a one-person show. So what I really liked about this quote is the emphasis on community. No matter how you slice it, the basic mission of the Academy, knowing, teaching, and learning, is at bottom communal. That mission cannot be pursued successfully in the absence of cultural support for community. So, of course, again, Kristen and I just have so much in common, which is probably why we work so well together. But I know that she and I have also had discussions about community, more specifically online communities, but communities in general, SA Reads being one of them. So I didn't know, Kristen, if you had any thoughts about this particular quote.
Yeah, there was some really great pieces in here, and I didn't write down all of them because it would have been like pages of quotes. Again, like I copied the entire book. But it was really talking about being able to take risks as part of a community, and to have that community support behind you, and that was really essential in order to create an integrative education. And so I thought that was a really fascinating idea, to be able to take risks while being supported by your community. Because so often I think we feel like we're taking risks and we're out there by ourselves, when really we need to think about how is our community supporting us. And if they're not, how do we start that support system? How do we enable that support system for others so that we're allowing people to take essentially safe risks, but they're stepping out and they're safe because we're supporting them, we're behind them.
Hmm. And it's that whole concept, I think, that we've been discussing. You've probably seen it on Twitter as well, but we've had many discussions about community and what that means in allowing people, and maybe allowing isn't even the right word, but giving people the space to take risks or to say things that might not always be popular or to try out new opinions or new ideas. So it's creating that safe space, and also the term that I really liked, and I wish I could credit who told me about this, but I've been calling it the brave space a little bit more. Can't take credit for that. Someone else much smarter than me said that, and I've just taken it. Um, but the idea, as Kristen was talking about, that space to take risks. And again, something that we talk a lot about in higher education and something that we talk a lot about for our students and for ourselves. But again, Parker Palmer almost makes it to me like it is inevitable and necessary that risks will be taken and that a community will need to rise up and support someone when they choose to step outside their comfort zone or do something daring and different. Frankly, I think Parker might agree that that's in part what education is all about, really taking those risks and learning through trial and error, learning through failure, as well as learning through success. But having that community around to support and to push. I know we've talked about challenge and support years and years ago, but I think Parker really takes that to the next level and makes it so it's not just a one-to-one or someone having to do that for themselves, but really bringing a community behind them to do both.
Yeah, what she said.
Yes. I got it. I'm going down the list. Actually, Kristen, another thing that was really interesting that might be worth talking about. Parker Palmer, when he talks about higher education or learning or pedagogy, he uses words like love a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And that's potentially not something very different from the way a lot of people think. But I know in a lot of the work that we do, when you look at theories and you look at other literature and student affairs, we may use those terms. And we often talk about the Office of Friendly Niceness and how much we love everyone and how student affairs is such a touchy-feely, friendly profession. But we often do that in jest, and in some cases we do that as a complaint rather than an area of advantage for us in student affairs. But Parker Palmer uses terms like love openly and freely in talking about higher education. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I thought that was really fascinating. It made me wonder how many faculty would take this book seriously, to be honest. There was that question. And I should mention, this book is also by Arthur Zajonc, which I probably totally massacred his last name, but he also wrote half the chapters. And so he talks a lot about an epistemology of love and this idea that we have to really care about what we're studying. And so, for example, if you are studying a plant, that you really get to know that plant and really love it in order to better understand it. And so why don't we do that with people as well? Why don't we really get to know them and understand them so that we can better understand their stories and how we can better educate them? So I thought that was a really fascinating approach to looking at how we make education a more more fully expanding for the student.
And I mean, we talk so much about stories, not just with essay reads, but that's my assessment philosophy as well. And so, of course, the minute I saw stuff about stories, I knew this was going to be a good book for me.
I knew when I pulled that one, I thought of you.
Yeah, I knew it. Kristen knows me very well, whether she wants to or not. But that whole idea of stories absolutely rang very true for me. So, of course, I'm biased, and could talk the whole hour just about that one quote. But the notion of stories and storytelling, it goes back to what we were just talking about in terms of love, but also in terms of community, and holistic. When we talk about students bringing their whole selves, when I talk about assessment, students are on a particular path or journey, and we get to them at some point in the path. It could be the beginning of their path in higher education, but it's not the beginning of their story.
Right.
So when we talk about that whole real world, they've already spent time in the real world, and they're spending time in the real world when they're not with us. So how are we any more or less special? So that whole notion of loving their story and recognizing and celebrating it, I think might fundamentally change the way we work with these students.
Well, and I love the idea that instead of asking somebody, what do you think about something, which immediately puts them in this almost a defensive mode, because they can always argue with what you think about something, right? And it takes you outside yourself to think. But to tell your story about something, who's going to argue with your story about something? It's your story. It's yours to tell. And so um, it's a less defensive place that you're telling that from. And I loved that idea.
Yeah, and also even thinking about coming from a place of competency for these students and coming from a place where you're not trying to trap them or trick them into thinking that they're not as smart as you are or that they need to prove something. Yes, they may be at some sort of power differential or difference, and that may always be the case just because we have positions in higher education. But the fact that they're coming in with a strong level of competence about their own story no longer puts them at a disadvantage and really sees them, as we often talk about, as equal partners in that journey, because they are the experts on their own story and the experts on their own goals. So it's our job really to guide that journey and potentially support them in whatever vehicle they choose to use to travel that path, but we're not the ones driving the car necessarily, or we're not the ones always laying down the brick for the path. The path's made of brick? I guess bricks? I guess so. They could be. I'm overextending the metaphor, but you know what I mean. So I just love the idea that, in my mind, maybe whether the authors intentionally meant to do this or not, it's bringing them to a place of competence and bringing students up to a level, if you will, that they're not often seen at as equal partners in this journey.
Right. One of the things that I thought was interesting, this mentions, they do mention that this isn't necessarily the end of the journey to integrative education, but that this is one step on the path, is this idea of sharing, of collaborating on courses. And so having cooperative courses or cooperative study where you might be studying art, but you're studying it through a lens of how it's impacted the culture. And so it's not just that you're studying art, you're also studying culture. And I really, really loved that idea of applying several different lenses to a subject to get a better understanding and a more whole understanding of that subject.
And it's funny because on the academic side of the house with faculty, that's, I wouldn't say common or easy to do, but it is something that a lot of faculty do. I mean, terms like interdisciplinary are thrown around on the faculty side so much. People have double majors, people do a major and a minor, people take elective courses. So on the faculty side and the academic side, we can talk about how well that works in another podcast or a separate conversation, but it is something that's done. But how often do we do that on the student affairs side of the house? How often does career services and first year experience collaborate beyond career services promoting themselves at new student orientation? How often, for me, how often did leadership development and career services collaborate, even though it was, in my mind, a perfectly natural pairing? Students are doing these things in part. It's not a bad thing if they're getting skills that they can actually write about on their resume and that will be useful for what their goals are. And again, I'm making hugely gross generalizations, and it's entirely possible, and people can tweet about it on the SA Reads SA Chat hashtag if there are such things happening, which I'm sure there are, and I'm sure they're fantastic, and I'm sure they're going to make great conference proposals, hint, hint. But it's not always the case, or not something that we necessarily talk about. We certainly talk about the silos of the academic and the student affairs, but I think within student affairs, we're also fighting against those as well. And again, the whole idea of integrative education is to integrate, shockingly, and to bring these portfolios together and to bring these ideas together, just as Kristen said, multiple perspectives, you're absolutely correct, and multiple lenses to be able to understand something. I mean, if you're looking at a whole thing, you can't look at it from one lens, just grammatically even, or I guess logically, that doesn't make any sense.
Absolutely. I'm looking for our next quote that we want to talk about.
It's like Kristen and I are just having coffee together, you know, just hanging out, talking about our book.
One of the things that the book talks about a little bit, which I thought was interesting, was this idea that it's hard to start these conversations on your campus, to have these conversations about integrative education, mainly because you may bring that up and because it's not the norm, because it's changed, because it's different than how we've thought about education in the past, that you may encounter a lot of obstacles. And so there's even some kind of guidance in this book about how to really have those educations, how to seek out those others. And one of the things that he mentions is, how do you let others know that you're interested in integrative education? Because he would talk about, Parker Palmer talks about going to speak at universities and having 5 or 6 people come up to him and saying, I believe that, but nobody else here does. And so he finally got to this point of saying, well, how have you let people know that's how you believe?
Yeah, and I wonder how a lot of what we do in knowledge sharing and student affairs helps or hinders that. I mean, Kristen and I are having a conversation right now about integrative education, and we're quite obviously on the pro side of that idea and sharing that with hopefully several thousand watchers and listeners currently.
Or 5, you know.
5,000. The number's about the same. There's just zeros at the end. And there's the American-Canadian conversion, too, so it could be any number, really, depending on the day and the exchange. But I wonder, too, you know, when we talk about these things, how we talk about them, even something as simple yet as profound as the language we use. Integrative education isn't necessarily a term that is used a lot, necessarily. Parker Palmer, when he speaks at universities, might use the term in the title of his talk or presentation, and that might not be something that's of interest because people don't know what it is, or don't understand what it is, or have a different understanding of what it is. And how do we, which I love that Parker's doing, not just talking the talk, but walking the walk. So how do we do this? What does it look like? And for someone like me, who's very action-oriented and loves to talk about these things, but then wants to know what the point is. What can we do about it? How are we going to get there? That all sounds well and good, but let's actually put this into practice and make it something that's manageable and doable, of course. But being able to create that common vocabulary, I think, is probably one of our first steps. Understanding what we mean by integrative education, and probably more importantly, what it looks like in our unique context. Every institution is different, just as every student is. So how do we make it not just something that makes sense, but makes sense for you or for me or for us?
Absolutely. So I'm going to share my favorite quote from the book. This was absolutely my favorite quote. If higher education does not help people learn how and why to take the risks of love, its moral contributions to the world will fall far short of its potential. I know it's a big one, isn't it? I shared this in a couple of different places when I read it, because it would just like hit me, because I was like, yes, that's exactly it. That's what we should be doing. If we're not teaching people how to do this, what is the point of, what is our point?
Now we're getting existential. Everyone's like, what is the point? Why are we here? What's happening? Well, Kristen, why do you think we're not doing that right now? Or where do you think we're not doing that right now?
Well, I think it goes back to, you know, some of that we get so focused in our subjects, and we look at those and we talk about those, and we expect everybody else to love those as much as we do, but we're not really teaching people how to love those the way that we do. We just kind of say, you know, I love this much, and why wouldn't everybody love it? And so instead of taking that extra step to really teach people how to do that, or even taking the time. I mean, you think about the amount of information that we have to cover in a semester's worth or a quarter's worth or whatever time period's worth for each class. How do you even begin to take the time to really delve into a topic enough to love it?
Mm-hmm. And I like what you said, too. It's almost like, I don't know if this is the right word, but almost an entitlement wrapped up in that love, like in a possessiveness wrapped up in it, which frankly goes counter to some of what the book is talking about in terms of community. So if I feel this entitlement or this possessiveness about what I love, I'll share it or share it in a very different way than I would if I'm coming from a place of integrative, holistic, whole person love for a community, wanting to advance the community and move it forward, as opposed to holding on to this love and this entitlement or status or whatever it is that comes with caring for something and knowing something so deeply. You can also even think about it in terms of the power and privilege associated with knowledge, and how we commodify knowledge and information, and we hold on to it and we share it in a way that keeps it a commodity, as opposed to sharing it in a way that really brings up, as Kristen said, that whole idea of love and morality and morals that really should be so central to that education. We have a tweet. Someone's watching, Kristen. There's at least one person that is watching. And thank you so much
for
reading along. And I agree. Sometimes storytelling absolutely can feel like a jargon or a gimmick. Kristen, what are your thoughts on Anne's tweet?
Well,
so she's basically saying she struggles with the term, the term storytelling because it can strike her, and I agree, as jargon or a gimmick sometimes.
Well, I thought it was interesting that she made the point in the context of the book she gets it. Because I felt that way about a lot of the phrases. Like, if you start telling me that education is about love any other time, I'm going to be like, okay, what? Like you were mentioning earlier. Like, oh, we're getting all touchy-feely. What is that about? But when you read it in this book, it makes sense. Like, it really, you get it. And so I can't encourage people enough to read this book, because if it turns somebody with like a hard heart like mine into actually believing it and feeling it, it can turn anybody. But I totally agree with her that in the context of the book, storytelling takes on a very different tone, and it's really about being able to bridge this gap that we have in order to be a community, bridging the gap between individuals so that we can become a community.
Mm-hmm. I feel like we had a Wizard of Oz moment there. Kristen has a heart.
I know, it's hard to believe. But,
well, not for me, but I'm obviously biased. But as I mentioned, I agree that term, and this is someone who loves story and storytelling and bases her entire assessment, let alone professional philosophy, on storytelling. So for me to say that sometimes it's jargony is a big deal. But I agree. I think sometimes that term can take on jargon when you think about storytelling as, I'm going to tell you what my story is, and I'm just going to share something. And people can hide behind stories for privilege. People can hide behind stories for power. People can use stories to elicit sympathy. People can use stories to distance. But I think there's great power in stories that are brave as well as authentic and come from a place of love. And that's just as true in the really exciting world of assessment as it is in any other area of higher education. So it can be jargon when we talk about storytelling for the sake of wanting it to be a program that looks better or in wanting to share. But it's more beyond the unidirectional, and something where I did a lot of community work where it really is that web. We actually use spider webs as pictorial representations of community to talk about theory and the community itself. And it really is so interwoven that a story is not just this open a book and read about it and then I'm going to pass it over, but it really is connection and conversation, and it's a living organism. It's not I have written my story, it's I'm writing my story. So I think the jargon there really comes in, here it is, here's my story, beginning, middle, end, and it's neat and tidy, and look, we're talking about it and we're sharing things, but not from a place of compassion or understanding context, or just being sensitive to the other person and what that story is. And there's such power in it because people have to be willing and able to share it. Just as knowledge is a commodity, stories to me are probably the richer commodity. The exchange is better on stories than it is on knowledge. So I think that in and of itself takes away some of the jargon if it comes from that place.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sorry, I just got a note from Kevin, which I'm assuming he's watching, and said that there are dozens of us. So I'm going to take you literally, Kevin, and I'm going to expect a full report on the dozen people that are watching. I'm allowed to do that because Kevin and I have worked together before. But I'm happy to hear that there are people paying attention and following along with us. As I said, as much as Kristen and I love to talk with each other and usually talk to ourselves, it's nice to know that other people are listening and following along too. And as Kristen mentioned, we would encourage you to share your favorite quote or some of your ideas or reactions to what we're saying, because the nice thing right now is Kristen and I can just say whatever we want. No one's really calling us on it besides Anne right now. So feel free to share your ideas and thoughts with us as we get near the end. I'm just looking at the time. As we get near the end, some of our conversation today. Going back through your novel, Kristen.
I know. It's not mine. It's Parker Palmer's.
Hell yeah.
You know, one of the things, and we're going to do this in a little bit, we're going to continue talking about this book for a little bit longer, but one of the things that when I started Essay Reads that I wanted to do was to allow a space for people to share what other books they were reading, because I know that there's a huge community of us that like to read just about anything we get our hands on. And so I thought this would be a fun space to do that. So Lisa and I are also going to spend a little time talking just about giving like mini book reviews of some books other books that we've been reading towards the end here. So maybe a couple more quotes that we can look at, and then we'll go ahead and do our mini reviews.
Sure. There was another one. I mean, they're all good, Kristen. They're all good. There was one. Here it is. So what I really liked, which again, for people who know me, the fact that I like this quote at all might be a little bit shocking, because basically it talks about patience and restraint, two words that don't really end up in a description of me. While insight is the guide of wise action, its accomplishment requires restraint. We must pause to reflect before speaking, quietly engage the issue inwardly before acting, open ourselves to not knowing before certainty arises, and so we live for a time in the question before the answer emerges. Now, as a card-carrying extrovert on the MBTI, I had to go, I'm sorry, what? Quiet and reflection and internal reflection. Of course, Kristen's sitting there as a card-carrying introvert going, yeah. But I love that, and I love the idea of sitting in the question. So that was kind of my whoa quote, Kristen. You had one of yours, and this was my whoa, my goodness, stop and take a minute quote. The whole idea of sitting in that uncertainty and how much that alone is a risk for a lot of our students and for a lot of us. So we talked about risk-taking and community and how we often think of risk as this daring, like, I'm going to do this and I'm going to jump off the metaphorical cliff into the great unknown. But it's also not being sure and potentially admitting that, or just sitting in that space and letting things percolate and reflecting. And for me personally, not just being an extrovert, but the way I work and the way I understand things, taking time to sit in uncertainty is huge for me. And something I'm not very good at, and something I'm working on being better at, and just inviting that into my life. So that was my whoa moment, that we need to model uncertainty, and we need to be okay with that, and model that it is okay to be in that space.
Well, and the thing that I love about that quote is that it says at the beginning, well, insight is the guide of wise action.
Mm-hmm.
It's not being so stuck inside our brain, so stuck inside ourselves that we never get anything done either. Mm-hmm. This is about action. And that's ultimately the result of this. And I think that that's a tendency that we have, is to spend all this time mulling and, for lack of a better word, committee sizing. New word. Topics that instead of taking action, we just think over them and think over them and think over them. And I think that's a classic example of a person who fears risk.
Mm-hmm.
And this is allowing us, again, this goes back to that idea of safe risks or wise risks, to pull the language from that, and that you think about it and you mull over it and you have that uncertainty, but ultimately it leads to an action.
Mm-hmm. Which makes me feel better that there's also action involved. I can do that. I can do that part.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's important to remember, because if you're an introvert like me, it's easy to just mull and not get to the action. But
yeah, and as an extrovert like me, it's easy to not mull and go straight to the action. So it's nice to see that emphasis and need for both. And so the powers of ours two combined, Kristen, we're pretty much perfect.
There we go.
Do you have any final quotes before we get into what else we're reading?
All of them.
Done.
Yeah. Right.
I'll just forward this email to everybody.
There we go. I should set it up as a Google Doc, and
totally.
I may do that. I will try to set it up as a Google Doc and have others add their favorite quotes. Of course, we'll end up with the whole book by the time we're through. So, but it's good stuff. Yeah, I really think we've covered most of these, or at least some semblance of most of them.
So, Kristen, tell me what else you are reading, because I know this is not the only book you're up to right now.
What else am I reading? I'm in between books because I just finished this book. But I read, this past month I read, or this past couple months, I read 1Q84, which is a sci-fi book. But it's fascinating. It's two different stories. There's a woman's story and this guy's story, and they are very interwoven. And so it's a very long book. I will say that. I should preface it with, it's a very long book. It's about 1,000 pages. and you have to pay attention. You can't skim, which I sometimes skim longer books. But this one you can't. You have to pay attention to it because their stories are so interwoven. There are these small details. So it's super good, though. It was really good. And it's set in Japan.
Ooh. I like the idea of a sci-fi book. It's not usually a genre I gravitate toward.
I don't either.
Yeah.
This totally caught me off guard. I was like, check it out.
I love when that happens. New little essay reads insight right there.
What are you reading?
Well, I'm kind of in between as well. If anyone saw in the essay reads hashtag, I really cannot be let into libraries unsupervised. It's a bad idea. So I walked out with a stack, and I've begun working my way through the stack. I have a few favorite mystery novelists. Kathy Wrights, I believe is how you pronounce her name. Her books are the inspiration for the TV series Bones. And I was reading her books long before the series came out. But I love her writing style. It's really accessible, but there's also a deep sense of social justice and commitment to what can be really heavy and hard but important issues. So I picked up what I believe is her latest book. I can't remember the title because it's over there. But she was talking about human trafficking. So it's this mystery story set around Temperance Brennan, and some of it's very light and interesting. And, you know, Temperance has this very rich and complex social life, but she'll also hit you over the head with really important insights and personal stories into things like human trafficking. I mean, she's also talked about just other really icky issues in human nature that comes through her life in forensic anthropology. I'm also reading right now. Sue Grafton does what's called the Alphabet Mystery Series. A is 4, B is 4. Again, really accessible read, probably less on the social justice side and more just on a fun, I just want to read a mystery novel, really cool female private investigator who kicks a lot of butt. So that's really fun to read. Nothing horribly profound in there other than just a really fun read.
You need to check out Dennis Lehane.
Ooh, I think
have you read any of his?
No.
He's got really great stuff. So, like, for example, Mystic River is one of his movie.
Yeah.
But also he's, I think it's Gone Baby Gone is also a movie, which I still haven't seen the movie for, but there's these questions of, it's kind of similar to what you were talking about, these questions of these detectives find this kidnapped child, and the child is being well taken care of, and they're talking about, do we take this kid back to this home that may not be so good? You know, I mean, it's grappling these serious questions. So,
cool.
It was very good.
Right.
Yeah.
That's my next library adventure, another stack afterwards.
There you go.
Yeah, I think the other one that hit me over the head, and I've talked to Kristen about it because she's, of course, read it before me, is Wild by Cheryl Strayed. Now, this book, and Kristen and I, teaser, may be finding a way to integrate this into some of our discussions later on in the month, or next month, but this book is amazing. I want to meet Cheryl Strayed, but I am also horribly intimidated by this woman. So she was going through a particularly rough patch in her life, personally, professionally, a little bit of everything, and decided to hike the Pacific Coast Trail as a way for, I guess, redemption, renewal, just feeling like you have nothing left to lose kind of thing. This trail runs the entire Pacific coast, coming from the Mojave Desert all the way through to my neck of the woods in Canada, and she hiked a pretty significant portion of it. And the book is sort of her recounting through her journals and other means of record keeping what that journey was like, both physically, and let me tell you, she goes into some interesting detail about what it was like physically, but she also talks about the emotional and mental challenges and reflections and insights that came from this incredibly, in my mind, brave and in other ways very terrifying and potentially ill-advised adventure. But it's an amazing read. She is a phenomenal writer. Definitely hit me over the head right from page one. I skimmed it not because I wanted to finish it, but because I was just so enthralled in it and wanted to know what had happened. So she's a phenomenal writer. Apparently it was also made into a movie, which I didn't know. Reese Witherspoon played her. And I watched the trailer and was hit over the head again. So, I'm smarting from all of the profoundness that's happening. But I think it's a phenomenal read if you're even just thinking about pushing the limits of renewal and pushing the limits of, I guess, coming back from adversity. This is like the extreme of personal development, if you will, but really great read.
Yeah, absolutely. She's also written a book called Tiny Beautiful Things.
Mm-hmm.
Have you read that one?
No, but it's on my list.
You need to. It's this whole advice column that she wrote for a while.
Oh, yeah.
Made me want to be an advice columnist. So, like, her books make me want to do things like that.
So
Wild
we're hiking
made me
the
want to
Pacific
hike.
Coast Trail. Okay, got it. Well, next essay reads will be coming from the road. Kristen and I will be in the middle of nowhere with some trees behind us and heavy backpacks.
Here we go. Of course, we'll have no Wi-Fi either, so.
We'll just record it for later.
Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, we'd love to hear what all of you are reading as well. I've seen a few things come in based on our chat today, and thank you for that. But I've also been checking out the hashtag and seeing a few other people talking about books that are on their list. And just as a plug, if anybody, student affairs or otherwise, is doing any reading at all, 52 and 52 challenge or any sort of challenge, I've also created a Facebook group, our 2014 Reading Challenge group on Facebook. So you can tweet me and I can connect you to our Facebook group where we share fun articles about reading, book lists, and we encourage each other on our reading goals. There are a lot of people doing 52 and 52, so 52 books in the 52 weeks of the year, but other people are doing, 12 and 12, for example. So lots of variations on reading goals. Our goal is just to get people reading more and to support people in achieving those goals.
Yep, absolutely. And of course, Essay Reads hashtag for whatever you're reading.
Anything. We'll take it all.
Anything. So, well, I think that's what we have for today. So, we are recording this, and the link will be available. Well, it's already available. We'll tweet it out again later, and feel free to continue tweeting at us. We'll keep answering them as they come in, as we can. And it was good talking with you today about books.
Absolutely. Send us any suggestions you have for future books. Because if not, Kristen and I have a whole stack, so we'll just keep plowing through. So interrupt us where possible. Let us know what you're reading. Let us know what you want to chat about. Let us know if you want to join us for some essay reads discussion. We will bring the coffee if you bring the book. But as Kristen said, thanks so much for joining us, and have a fantastic Tuesday.
Bye.
Bye.